AFS Artistic Director Richard Linklater, please come to the stage. Stars. Wow, star 80. You guys ready? How many of you have seen a 35 print of this? Back in the day. Awesome. How many of you just saw Fosse dancing the snake from The Little Prince? We put that up there? If you haven't seen that, check it out. Isn't that amazing? The guy's like 47, 48, doing all those moves. He's like, if you go online, like YouTube, there are all these, they show Michael Jackson, how he supposedly stole all his moves from Bob Fosse, which is, kind of true to some degree. But Fosse loved Michael Jackson. He asked him to direct Thriller and all that, but Fosse was like, he loved Michael Jackson. He's like, he's this second greatest dancer who ever lived, behind Fred Astaire. And but he said he's just too weird. He has plastic plants, and he didn't know what to do. So they kind of talked about collaborating, but they never did. But it's pretty obvious that Fosse had that kind of impact on dance. I mean, I think Fosse is like, to me, he's like a god. I mean, who else? Let's think about it. We can talk about it after. Lars and I will be after, but let's talk about this. What other directors had the impact in both theater, theater and film, who made their kind of genius contributions to both? A lot of directors have been in both, obviously, but who had that huge impact? I would say Kazan and Fosse. That's my vote for the two. Busby Berkeley, maybe, from a long time ago. But, it's something to think about. But to me, Fosse can do no wrong. He made 4.5 great movies. Sweet Charity was his first. He had originated that on Broadway, made a film of it. There's some amazing stuff in it, but it's not the full, I don't think anyone considers it like a great film. But Cabaret right after that, he reinvents the musical, and he just keeps going, so. And I think a lot of this series, I'm talking about these 80s films and giving you my subjective experience of them. But I think when this came out in '83, I had only seen Cabaret and all that jazz. And I was so looking forward to, this next Bob Fosse film. And I remember going to it and just being, like everyone, who's seen it, was just being, floored, just being stunned. I mean, this movie is, like a couple weeks ago we showed Melvin and Howard, a true story kind of ripped from the newspaper that is a feel-good movie. Well, this is the complete opposite. This is a true story that is a feel-bad movie. I don't know any other way to put it. It's a story that just stunned everybody at the time. I remember it. Anyone my age will remember it. When the Playmate of the Year, Dorothy Stratton, was killed by her estranged husband and then who committed suicide. So I'm not giving any spoilers here. Fosse shows it very early in the movie. That's the tragedy we're dealing with here. But, so, I'm, they're not giving anything away. That's what it is. But people wondered at the time, like, I love this movie. I just thought it was, I was that age where all that mattered was art. Like this guy had expressed something so dark and deep, and it was such a dark reflection of our culture, I think, at that moment. It's kind of like Fosse creates this, well, he doesn't create it, he recreates it, It's a very exacting recreation, I think, of the tragedy, but he does this thing where he creates like a modern living hell in a very glossy atmosphere that everyone might aspire to. Oh, hanging out in the Playboy Mansion with Hefner. Oh, Playmates around. All this aspiration, but kind of through this one character, Paul Snider, played it's an incredible performance by Eric Roberts. But he finds some sympathy for this psycho. That's, I think, when someone would have thought you're going to make a movie about this tragedy, that wouldn't necessarily be the take. But I think that's his own view. Like Fosse was apparently got obsessed with this story, and it was a Village Voice article, The Death of a Playmate. He optioned it, worked on the story, and just sort of got completely obsessed with it. And everyone who worked on it with him it had this kind of tragic inevitability. They say it was, the whole production was sort of doomed. You know, it had this kind of dread because he shot in chronological order, and it's all progressing to the last scene. And Fosse was sort of completely obsessed with recreating it. The last scene is in the actual house off the Santa Monica Freeway in LA. He filmed at the beginning in Vancouver. She's from Vancouver. It's the actual neighborhood. They didn't get her house, but they got like a couple doors down. He was just obsessed with kind of recreating this, kind of like the way a journalist might. He uses interviews. There's a lot of facts and a lot of people's perspectives. But, I mean, this movie was such an intense portrayal of what I considered like a hell. He had created a hell, sort of the end of the do you think I'm sexy and you want my body disco 70s. It was such a dark picture of that and the people in it, you know, all their desires. I mean, I think this could be like an Upton Sinclair novel from the early 20th century about how people as commodities, how it tears them apart, and people wanting so much. And, you know, to me, that's where the depiction of this lies. And his point of view on it, like, I think the most telling thing I've read, and there's a great Fosse biography that came out just in the last few months that I checked out. And there's a line, I wanted to know, I was very interested in the chapter on this movie because it's always fascinated me. But there's a line, apparently, he pulled Eric Roberts aside when, at some point in the production, and people heard him off stage kind of telling him, like, hey, don't you get it? You're playing me if I wasn't successful. You know, Bob Fosse thought this was in some crazy way a self-portrait of himself. And he really finds some sympathy for Snyder. He says the guy had some expertise. The guy, for all his smarminess, you know, he invented that Chippendales, you know, male dancers. He's very much a product of that time. But he said he would have been really successful if he hadn't have been a psycho. He kind of took that approach to it, you know, like, and he was quoted on set, like Cliff Robertson, who plays Hugh Hefner in the movie, said Fosse was just kind of mumbling, you know, he was talking to him and just kind of said, he's gonna, you know, like, I don't want him to die. I like him too much, you know, his characters. And then a little later, he's like, you know, he's gonna kill her. Fuck, there's nothing I can do to stop him. You know, he was just in this zone of, you know, this whole trip down, like what compels someone to, you know, want to tell this story. I have a lot of admiration for that, you know, I mean, it's tough. That's what artists do. You know, Fosse to me is like the Lenny Bruce of film directors. And not just that he was drug addicted, but that he was, he had a massive bullshit detector. You know, there's really not a lot of false notes in anything Bob Fosse ever did. You know, I just think it's where he comes from. You know, he was a kid from Chicago who danced. I think the key to Fosse is his upbringing. He was pretty neglected. He had this tremendous talent as a dancer and choreographer at a very young age. So he was in wildly inappropriate places. If you know all that jazz, he shows a little bit of it when the young Joe Gideon is being, these older burlesque performers are basically, you know, abusing him. It's kind of funny, but it's true that there was a 13-year-old boy, Bob Fosse, who was in an environment he really shouldn't have been. It would have been called child abuse today, but that's his background. He saw show business from the absolute bottom rung of kind of the end of vaudeville, burlesque, the divey shitholes in Chicago. That's kind of where he didn't go to conservatory. He came up through the worst parts of it. And you see it in, you know, Sweet Charity, all his work. They're not glamorous. You know, they're the opposite of that. Sweet Charity, there's some really, a lot of miles on those ladies, you know. It's not, you know, he's the, you know, good, bad, go, you know, fun movie, bad movie, you know, Cabaret. Think about it, it's the worst of the 20th century, you know, the darkest moment of the 20th century mixed with kind of the lightest form of entertainment, this kind of German vaudeville. He had those contrasts bouncing off each other. And even though this film is tragic, it's not kind of fun to watch. He you know, it's the razzle-dazzle from Fosse. He keeps it lively. He has entertaining moments, and there's a lot of humor. Believe it or not, at least I haven't seen this in 20 whatever years, but I remember my friends and I at the time, there was a lot of humor mainly in the Paul Schneider and the people around. There's that smarmy, desperate quality that made him such an unappealing character. But he's, that's his flaw. If Fosse seems to be saying, if Snyder, yeah, he's a pimp, he's a lowlife, but is he that much different than, it's a class issue. What's Hefner? They do it with more aplomb. They do it at a higher level. Paul Schneider is trying to get into their world, and he's being kind of kept out. He sees everything around him. He's a flesh peddler. He's trying to capitalize on everything around him. And this poor innocent young woman he meets in Vancouver is his ticket. So it's this desperate portrayal of that I think brings the tragedy. But there's also a lot of humor, And this film was vilified when it came out. I had such an intense experience watching it. Particularly, I think Eric Roberts' performance, but all of them. Meryl Hemingway's great as this innocent woman who's really just trying to please everyone. She's too nice, and she's hooked up with the worst guy imaginable, who's taking her on where society thinks maybe you should go. If you have a certain, it's about powerlessness, I guess. But what was I just saying?
It was vilified when it came out.
Yeah, everybody hated this movie, and I remember defending it so much. I was like, people were like, oh, that movie's a piece of shit. I'm like, no, it's about a piece of shit. The movie's great. There's a difference. It's about a lot of pieces of shit that we all are. This is about us, as a culture. That's how I saw it. But everybody hated it. It got horrible reviews. I mean, with some notable exceptions. I remember watching Siskel and Ebert, and I think Siskel really liked it a lot. And even at the end of the year, come Oscar time, he was complaining that Eric Roberts didn't get an Academy Award nomination for his performance here, and you'd have to agree. This is that great moment where Eric Roberts was on the ascent. He had done, I think, just Raggedy Man and Time of the Gypsies. This was his third film, and he and Mickey Rourke, they were like the guys then. It was like Pope of Greenwich Village, and he was just he's so great in this movie. But this movie left scars on, I think, everybody. They all sort of paid. Meryl Hemingway said she didn't work for years after. It was just such a dark experience, I think, for the viewers. They walked away stunned. Critics, it's almost like they wish, as you wish this wouldn't happen in real life, you almost wish the movie didn't happen. But I don't know. I always thought that's what art's supposed to do, isn't it? It's supposed to provoke us. It's supposed to make us think. It's supposed to look behind the curtain. And I think Fosse does such an admirable job of this depiction of this world he felt compelled to create. And he went to his grave thinking this was his, best film, that he had done what he had set out to do. So we want to honor that tonight and watch this print of this movie. And we'll be back after to talk all about it. Shit. Ooh. Okay, so a lot of these movies, I was talking about the 70s hangover. I said this one, like I said last week, this is definitely the end of the 70s. This movie is where it's over. Hollywood that was it. They had declared war on the artists. This guy Alan Ladd, who was kind of the greatest studio exec of the 70s.
Alan Ladd Jr.
Alan Ladd Jr.
Famous
Yeah.
Alan Ladd,
Son
the
of
actor,
Alan
yeah.
Ladd. He agreed to this movie for no other reason than he read it and said, it's a bummer, but he says, well, Bob's a genius, I want to back, as an artist, I'll just back what he's doing. But this is the same executive who he would greenlight Robert Altman films in the 70s. Things like, Altman would go to him and say, I had a dream the other night about these women in the desert, these two women, and he had this, and he'd say, well, that sounds cool, let's make that movie. That's Hollywood,
Yeah.
I mean, my God. So this is the end of that,
So Hollywood's not like that now?
Yeah, something like that. No, but I always said, 83, things were changing. We had kicked out of office the president who told us, that things weren't great, in the world or even spiritually. Carter had that. So we elected an actor who said how great everything was. And, everything's great. If you have a problem with it, the problem's with you. It's like, you're not being very patriotic. So you could just see the 80s had started. And by this point, it was over. That's why I think a film like this is much more of a 70s film where people, in Vietnam, people could deal with tragedy. It was all around them. But by this point, the culture had just said, okay, that never happened. We're looking forward and everything's great. So pretty soon the 80s is producing stuff like Top Gun and, it's just all this from then on.
It was like the decade of like furious denial.
Yeah. Even they started, the Vietnam War was fought again and again, starting with Rambo. We started winning the Vietnam War, or at least, we did a pretty good job. It's just like, wow. So this movie was just so out of place. Kind of like other movies in this series. King of Comedy is a good example. Yeah. And I would say in this year, too, believe it or not, Scarface, I would put it in the same category. That movie was vilified. People were like, just, oh my God, that, no. Because that was such a, reflection, just a, picture of our society that no one wanted to see either. So,
this movie and a lot of the other movies in this series make a case for like taking the long view of film history. Like a movie comes out and then it's it's either a hit or it's not. And generally the way that its box office performs, it kind of is the way that it kind of is initially written down in film history.
Out of the gate.
But then like things like this screening happen and other things happen and a film will begin to be revised into where it goes.
That certainly happened with Scarface. That did okay at the time, but then its cult status just pretty immediately. Well, because this was the era now you had video, so you could watch a film over and over, and things were video hits where that didn't exist in previous generations. So this was the first generation where a film could not do that well, and then 6 months later, it's available for everybody, and that's where King of Comedy and so many other films kind of got their legs. Star 80, while it's known, I never quite there's nothing to rally around to say, you gotta see, it's like, ooh, it's just not, Eric Roberts is just chillingly, brilliant in it, but it's such a smarmy, creepy feeling to hang out with him.
Although you might not want me to repeat this, but we were talking about this earlier, and you were like, "Yeah, my friends and I used to quote those lines from."
Oh yeah, but we were crazy though. We were very fucked up guys. It's that Lishby action, the schmuck bastard. No one says fuck as well as him either. I think in cinema history that fuck the way he kind of spits it and pulls it out. It's a good. I don't know. We may never see that again.
Why did his career hit the skids? Drugs?
I think he had some problems. But he was hot. Runaway Train, he was the star. Coca-Cola Kid. Eric Roberts, after this, unlike Mariel Hemingway, I don't know why. Why they pick on her. Fosse was definitely never getting another movie made. And she wasn't working, but Eric Roberts popped out of this with some, he was the star of like 5 movies in a row. I think he had some problems later in the decade. I remember in '88 I was in New York and he was starring on Broadway in Burn This, and I got my ticket. It's like a Saturday night show or something, and then you get there and you open the playbill and the part of Pale is he wasn't even there. So I was like, oh, what the fuck, So I think he was having problems, but he's a pretty complex guy. I know guys have worked with him and stuff, but there's a story here where. After they did the movie, there was a woman who was kind of a consultant. She had worked around, I think she had introduced Fosse to Hefner, and they got on pretty well. And Hefner gave him the permission, for Playboy to use insignias and stuff for the movie. And so she was around kind of a consultant, like trying to get things right about what goes on at the mansion, what they're drinking, all the details right. And at the end, he got kind of obsessed with her, apparently. But at the end of the shoot, she took him at wrap sometime the next week. She took him to Dorothy Stratton's grave in Westwood Cemetery. I've actually seen it. It's right where, Marilyn Monroe's there. Hefner's spot is waiting right above Marilyn Monroe. But yeah, her grave is there. And apparently Eric Roberts went there and just broke down and cried and, just had this moment there for him.
Have you ever made a movie that was like intense all the way through, or you just totally?
Hell no, I don't want to hang out with. No, I'm too. Not like that. Yeah, the tension of this, and like I said it in the intro, but apparently the crew, it was just kind of a tough shoot. It built, like Fosse choreographed the entire movie, and he had like 6 weeks of intense rehearsal with Hemingway, Roberts, and some of the other actors would come in. So it's this intense 6 week, and he, like a musical, he had the whole thing choreographed. Every move, every shot was like, had a purpose, and he was down this rabbit hole of just intensity about the whole movie, except the end, the scene in the house, like I said, their actual house. And no one knew what was coming there. No one had any idea, like, uh-oh, here it comes, you know, like they were just moving closer and closer to it. And then when they got there, Hemingway says it was just, he had it all planned. It was like a dance, you know, shotgun here, face here, shot, you know, it was just like this little dance they did for all those days of shooting it. But man, I can't imagine, you know. I mean, Robert says, yeah, it was tough. He was just kind of bummed the whole time playing that guy. Even though, he says that now, but back then I remember when there was that little bit of hoopla for his performance, and, you know, he was saying, like, he really bonded with Fosse. They really rock and rolled, and he felt, like, pretty exhilarated, as he should, as a performer. But, yeah, the subject matter you're hanging with is couldn't be grimmer, you know, so.
Yeah, I wonder if we have any contributions, questions, otherwise from the audience, and all the way in the back.
That's a question. I was curious because he was about the only person whose real name wasn't used. Does anybody know what Peter Bogdanovich thought of the movie?
Yeah, I mean, for legal reasons, apparently the lawyers swooped in. I mean, this was, they made it 20 years later, but it had just happened in 80, and this movie comes out in 83, so you can imagine they start prepping, you know, late, sometime in 81 or 82, and so it was still really fresh. And yeah, the lawyers, there were all these things you could and couldn't do. And, you know, changing everyone's name was a lot of the people was one thing. But no, you know, Bogdanovich, I mean, of course, I mean, can you imagine, you know, Peter Bogdanovich had to finish the film he was working on with Dorothy Stratton in it after this? I mean, I can't imagine, you know, I mean, but no, I think he hates the movie pretty much, you know. It showed some sympathy, or at least the point of view of Snyder, which how could he relate to? You know, there was actually another movie with Jamie Lee Curtis. It was a TV movie called Death of a Centerfold. It's pretty good. Bogdanovich said he liked that one more than this.
So Bogdanovich watched it.
I guess, yeah.
Man.
Yeah, I don't know.
Right over here.
I was just gonna. My mom to this day still loves Eric Roberts, no matter how many shitty talking cat movies he does.
Yeah.
Because of Star 80 and The Raggedy Man. And
Yeah,
was
right.
it mostly
It's a
just
wonderful movie.
drugs that just derailed him, or?
I don't know. What derails anyone? I mean, I don't know.
And didn't Peter,
Pretty intense guy, you
Yeah.
know.
But didn't Peter Bogdanovich end up marrying Dorothy Stratton's younger sister later
I
on?
think years later.
But they stayed married for a long time. It's not
Yeah.
like it was,
I know them, so I'm not going to talk a lot about that.
Are they like nice people?
They're very nice. Yeah. and they've suffered, as you can imagine. So I don't.
yeah. Hey, Denise.
Can you say anything about the portrayal of innocence in this film, or just in terms of it being in cinema? And because I'm old enough to remember the 70s, and it felt like it was a more innocent time. But I think that just like remembering photographs from my youth, I bring that to it when I see films like this. But both the Stratton character, she has that. I don't know if it was accurate that she could have truly maintained that kind of level of innocence, you know, working in an industry like that. But it would never be portrayed that way these days, and the world doesn't seem to be that way. But do you have any comments about like the portrayal of innocence?
Well, I think it just pre-internet. I think it was a more innocent time. I mean, you can see an interview. She was on the Tonight Show with Johnny Carson a few months before she died. And she's pretty innocent, pretty sweet. You know, she was only 20. You know, she'd been there a couple years. So, you know, little growing up in Vancouver, you know. But everyone projects, like people think, oh, the 60s ended at Altamont when the violence at the Rolling Stones concert, but it was this great time before. It's never like a great time. And the 70s they were pretty hedonistic, me generation, awful, but fun if you're, it just depends on what age you are during it, if you're there at all. So, I mean, I'd say every time has great stuff and horrible stuff. So I think that's what Fosse was kind of felt about his own life. Everything he ever touched was kind of amazing and kind of it had an undercurrent of not so good too. But he struggled himself so enormously. I think his life is a real triumph because that guy, I think it was that upbringing I was referring to. He really struggled, but found an equilibrium where he could create from. But it was tough for him.
Right back here.
What was your favorite shot when it was of the movie? Like, they use mirrors a lot. They use where he's looking at a car and he sees her reflection. Did that strike you? Or?
It's really beautifully lit and shot movie. Sven Nykvist, he would come to the U.S. and was starting to work in America. Bergman, this is the same year as Fanny and Alexander. It was Bergman's last film, so Nykvist comes to the U.S. and starts shooting movie. He worked with Nora Ephron. So I think this is one of his first early U.S. movies, and it kind of has a nice, the lighting but I don't know. I think there's so many great moments. I don't think so much about Fosse had a style. This is like he was kind of, if you look at All That Jazz, kind of pre-MTV. He really could razzle dazzle it up. I always felt I connected to it. It wasn't just they took that and made it just mindless imagery repetition that didn't mean a damn thing. His stuff, I think it really captures the mood of the scene. It's always appropriate somehow, his visual style. That's why I think he really is a cinematic genius. Every film he did, Lenny, which if you go back and look at that, he has the guts to put the camera in the audience in a 7-minute take while Lenny's being very boring on stage talking about his law case. He really found the right tone and the right look for every movie he was doing. And I think this is how Paul Schneider sees himself. Kind of these quick, flashy cuts. He's this character in this, kind of hyped up world, So, but there's so many, and this is what you were referring to when I said we laughed. There's just so many smarmy, pathetic moments that, my favorite, I think, is, at the beginning on their first date, he's talking about the Mercedes. I'm going to get it for you. And then what is it? An hour later, he's like, can you get by the bank? He's asking her. Like, ooh. It's just, it's kind of so pathetically sad. And this guy's so desperate and smarmy and just can't help himself. He just doesn't, ugh.
It's I do want to note we're talking all this about Bob Fosse. May 22nd we show all that jazz, and I think we assume kind of like old guys assume that like everybody's seen All That Jazz, but not everybody's seen All That Jazz.
All That Jazz is aging so well. It's so good. Now that's actually I think whatever Bob Fosse said to Eric Roberts was probably to get him pumped up and to let him know he had his back. I don't think he really felt he was there, Paul Schneider. But he does come out and say All That Jazz is, I think the term he used, it's 100% a 100% accurate portrait of 70% of Bob Fosse. So it's it's very autobiographical. He's the choreographer. He's making a movie. He's knows he's dying. Fosse had open heart surgery before he was even 50. And he knew his time was, last week I said it occurred to me, like Fosse got to make 2 last movies. All That Jazz is someone's last movie. And yet, he lived and made this one too. So 2 out of 5 movies were last movies.
I'm so
I don't
glad
know what
he
that says. Yeah.
I'm so glad he had a chance to
amazing.
make more. I wish he would have
But
lived.
no, Fosse's career, if you really study it, it's just amazing. And I just love him, his own view of things. In 1972, it's the famous thing about him that people throw out. It is an amazing fact that in the same year he won a Tony for Pippin, he won an Emmy and an Oscar. He beat Coppola for Godfather as Best Director for Cabaret. So in the same year, he won in those three. I mean, that has never happened before. It's never going to happen again. But it tells you something about his life and his, the scope of what he was doing. Liza with a Z, the thing he won the Emmy for is TV. He kind of reinvented the TV special with Liza with a Z. It's fantastic. You can get it. It's a great 1 hour when Liza Minnelli's kind of popping, just singing and dancing. It's amazing. But, so you would think at the height of whatever that would be for someone in those fields, he checks himself into like a psychiatric facility. He was not doing well. The idea of uber success and how he felt about himself did not go hand in hand. So when he got this public acclaim, he really didn't know what to do with it.
Let's take maybe one or more right over here.
Growing up in Southern California in the 70s, I loved how he put in that whole roller skating culture. Like that guy in the middle, like that was, I saw that skating on the Strand in Hermosa Beach when I was a kid.
Everywhere. Venice, the streets. It was like, one of Dorothy
couldn't go to
Stratton's
Venice,
movies is like is Skate Town, USA.
Yeah.
Which they call like ball bearings.
Yeah, they had to change all the names. Galaxine is the kind of sci-fi one. Yeah, it was so. I remember growing up here, but we'd see on TV like Venice Beach, all these people on skates, and I remember as a teenager going, that looks pretty fun. Those girls skating around in bikinis, like, that'd be a good. And then the way it's portrayed here, it's like, oh my God, just. Ugh.
My 5th grade birthday party was a roller skating
roller.
party.
It was like roller disco. This is the disco 70s, man. It was crashing.
And of course,
down.
talking about roller skates makes me think of submarines, which makes me think of next week's movie.
Yes, I was thinking the same thing.
Das Boot, which for some
Das
reason
Boot.
is not called The Boat, even though pretty much any anytime like a foreign movie comes to America, it gets retitled
The
like The
Boat.
Woman Next Door. Or
Well,
whatever.
Das Boot is so much better than The Boat. Anyone can have a boat, but
The
Das
Boat. Das Boot.
Yeah.
So that we're showing that next week in another beautiful print.
Yeah, there's actually, World War II German. Fosse did Cabaret. It's a nice segue.
Yeah, I think so.
I think it makes perfect sense to be the next movie we see. Suspenseful, a lot of tension.
And it's one that I don't think there's a whole lot of explanation. Well, the reason this is chosen is because of, it's just what a
one of the great movies of that era. Just like, oh my God, what a perfectly constructed story and
technical tour de force, etc.
So, can anyone who can get their hand up first? What's the connection between last week's director, Jean-Luc Godard, and Bob Fosse? Anyone remember? It's one of the most famous dance sequences of the French New Wave. Fosse choreographed the dance scene in Band of Part.
Oh,
Band
really?
of Outsiders. You know where they're dancing?
Yeah.
Look at the credits. Godard asked Fosse to choreograph. And it's kind of one of the most famous, I think, in my mind. It's one of the great dance sequences.
It's such a sort of sloppy kind of
Yeah,
dance
but no,
sequence.
look at it. He just did it really quick. But no, the way they're moving. Look at those moves. That kind of. Whoops,
No, it's great.
It's Fosse. Look at it again for that. I mean, that's one of Godard's
So Fosse,
great movies.
Fosse was like on vacation or something. I mean, he didn't bring
I don't know.
to do that, right?
He's a choreographer. He's a pro. He was,
That's
he's in
awesome.
mid-career. But if you ever want to go check that out. And, he would do weird things like show up in The Little Prince, as a favor to Stanley Donen. He got to choreograph his own sequence. This is 40 years ago. But that, those moves, those future Michael Jackson moves.
It's unbelievable.
The hat, you're like, wow, okay.
We're gonna play that.
Guy really had a vision, for the human body. His own, even. He was a great dancer himself.
I think some people
We'll play
we
that
played it
if
for the
we're done
pre-show.
here.
Some of you weren't.
You
in
want to
here
stay and
yet.
watch a 7-minute, uniquely weird
Which you-
sequence from a.
It's
not
really
a great
amazing.
movie, right?
It's a
Is it a great movie? Do you see it as a kid?
It was a great movie to see as a kid, but when you go back, don't
It's
go
a
back
weird
and watch
movie.
it because
There is this sequence when the little prince he encounters a snake in a tree, and it turns out to be Bob Fosse with a fake beard, but he's a snake. He's got so he moves like a snake.
And I don't think
And
we can
he talks a
amplify
lot, too.
how much this is Michael Jackson when you see these moves. I mean, Michael Jackson worshipped Bob Fosse. You will see it.
Well, like any good artist, he's taken from everything. I mean, Michael Jackson had such ability. I think he was just grabbing. So you'll see bits and pieces as you go, oh, but he took it to another level.
So that'll be our exit music. Dan, we're ready for it. Rick, thank you so much. You
Thanks
guys,
for
thank you
coming
so much.
to this. Come next week. Das Boot.
Thank you.